Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I'm your host, Alec MacDonald. Korea has been rocked by 4 months of political turmoil and division. It all began when now former President Yoon Suk Yeol declared martial law in a surprise move. The National Assembly quickly overturned it, even in the face of military soldiers deployed to its steps. Now, with the Constitutional Court upholding Yoon's impeachment, the nation is set to head to the polls on June 3rd. But what kind of precedent has been set, and what lessons or warning from Korea's past might shape its future? Today, to discuss Korea and democracy more generally, we are joined by Hwang, a professor of Korean history at the Australian National University. Professor Hwang, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now that the Constitutional Court has upheld the impeachment of Yoon Suk Yeol, what has immediate fallout and reaction been in Korea?
Well, from what I can gather in following news shows and commentaries, as well as news coverage online through the newspapers, etc., there appear to be two main topics of discussion that have dominated over the weekend. The first is to figure out why it took so long for the Constitutional Court to come to this verdict. I think the general sentiment was that, at least for those who supported the verdict, the ruling not only was correct, but that the expression of the justification for the ruling was done very well. It was done in plain language. It was done very clearly in condemning the coup attempt, in condemning what was expressed as a betrayal of the people's trust.
I want to focus first on the Constitutional Court and the length of time that it took to get to this ruling, because as you said, the language was very determined. The language was very clear. So do you think that it was a matter of the court ensuring that they got the correct language? Was there security concerns? Or is it a bit of both, that they want to make sure that their ruling was legally beyond a shadow of a doubt so that this case would be clear-cut over?
I think that last point is probably one of the major considerations that went into this. I noticed in the coverage of the verdict immediately afterwards that as much as there was a sense of incredible relief and celebration among those who supported the verdict, they also celebrated the 8-0 unanimous ruling, and that suggested that whatever disagreements there might have been over the finer points, that fundamentally this was a clear-cut case. And so it was almost like a sporting event, like as if Korea was in the World Cup and people were celebrating the outcome in victory, but also counting the score. I think that testifies to the extent to which perhaps the Constitutional Court justices wanted to present this united front, and there might have been some dealing going on among them in order to come to the expression of this unanimous ruling by addressing some of the finer points and maybe even objections from some of the conservative justices. So that, I think, will take more time to flesh out what exactly happened in the negotiations or the discussions among the justices to achieve this final result.
With all this going on, there are still democratic processes. Notably, it has been announced that the election for the new president will be held on the 3rd of June. What has the implications been, though, over the past 4 months on Korea's democracy?
Of course, on the surface, it's a mark of great shame that South Korea has had to impeach the second president over the last 3. And for very serious crimes. Of course, impeachment only can happen for very serious crimes. And we thought that the panoply of wrongdoing that the previous conservative president, Park Geun-hye, who was impeached, was extraordinary in the severity of the corruption that was revealed. But this matter blew that out of the water in terms of the scale and significance of the transgression committed by the sitting president. And that's why he was actually arrested while he was still president. I think we do have to focus on the conservative party, on the right wing of South Korean politics. Since democratization in 1987, there have been 5 conservative presidents, and actually just 4, because one of them, Kim Young-sam, was a former dissident and progressive who changed sides in a sense in order to achieve electoral victory. So if you count the others as the only core conservatives, all 4 of them were charged and convicted of serious crimes. And I'm counting here Yoon as well. So there's a disturbing shadow still from the dictatorship era. And it's something that has to be openly discussed and acknowledged.
Before moving or looking into the future, I want to quickly go to the past because you're an expert on Korean history. What has led to this rise or reformist where there is now a very sudden authoritarian sentiment once again rising or boiling to the top layer of Korean politics, where it's visible from outsiders looking onto the inside of the domestic processes of Korean's political systems? What has led Korea to this point where there's a rise in populism, where there's a rise in authoritarian sentiment, specifically on the right?
Yeah, the right-wing populism is the most visible and, frankly, the most concerning phenomenon. And there are several components of this. I mean, I think it will take a long time to kind of dissect this and to try to properly analyze it. But from a historical perspective, of course, you have the long-term anti-communism born of the national division. And that's a core component of all of this. There's another strong strain of the right-wing populism and authoritarian sentiment, and that is Christian nationalism. The party, the PPP party, the main conservative party, has in a great sense been not necessarily taken over by, but heavily influenced by Christian nationalists, whether they are hardcore mainstream Protestants, or whether they are even further to the periphery in terms of, well, Koreans call them, cults, and other Protestants might call them heretical groups, but these are very large, popular religious groups that are on the right fringe, and they're led by charismatic ministers. And then there's simply a large group of Koreans, just as you would find in many other democracies, who are very authoritarian in their orientation, whether it's their character or just their outlook on things, who want very clear-cut, simple solutions, and they look at things in a very simple, right or wrong manner. And so this is where you often get the specter and often the reality of a cult of leadership.
Moving to the lessons that can be learned from this, Taiwan shares a similar authoritarian past under the Kuomintang, and there are certain shadows of the past which both play into Korea's current politics and Taiwan's current politics. What lessons can other democracies, namely Taiwan, learn from what Korea has experienced over the past 4 months?
The parallels are really striking because both South Korea and Taiwan emerged in the midst of the reckoning of the Pacific War of the 1940s. And so immediately thereafter, in both China and Korea, there was a civil war that aligned the communists with the capitalists, or anti-communists, if you want to call them. And those groups, respectively, were heavily aligned with and controlled by the geopolitical powers, namely the Soviet Union and or China on the communist side, and the U.S. on the non-communist side. And just as South Korea had to endure a long period of post-war right-wing authoritarian militarist dictatorship, of course, Taiwan had to do the same. And I think the timing of democratization in both places, which was in the 1980s, was not coincidental. It was very much in the air back in the 80s, along with the Philippines and some other places too. And of course, in the early 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, all kinds of democratic movements arose around the world. I think the South Korean case and the Yoon coup attempt demonstrates that not only is a constant vigilance demanded in order to uphold a democracy, but a recurring consideration of the legacy of the past in the respective countries has to be strong and persistent, whether it's in the education system or in the open discussions of the political arenas, in order to acknowledge that there's always this possibility that the militarist authoritarian past can make a comeback depending on the circumstances. And the circumstances might simply amount to just a very bad leader who is inclined toward authoritarian rule, as in South Korea, has just emerged. And so that's something that we have to figure out, whether this is structural in South Korea or whether it was just this one crazy man supported by some crazy people who thought that this was okay.
I think that's an important point to wrap up this interview on, as I want to ask you, as a professor of history, as an expert in history, and looking forward, Korea has elections coming up soon. Taiwan faces a multitude of challenges right now. What can be done to make democracy more resilient? What can be done to help aid the vigilance that we heed towards democracy?
I'm not an expert on Taiwan, but my perspective on Taiwan would suggest that I think Taiwan is probably in better shape than South Korea. But of course, that means simply that the people of Taiwan have to still work at strengthening the democracy. And that's the case for all democracies around the world. Well, globally, it seems there is a lot to gain from a kind of regional connection or a sense of regional alliance here in East Asia among the democracies. And I should say not only in East Asia, but the Asia Pacific. You have this corridor going from north to south, from South Korea, Japan, and then going south to Taiwan, and then ending with Australia and New Zealand in the south. You have this corridor of liberal democracies, and some of them are very strong, and some of them, as we see in South Korea, are a little bit more vulnerable. But to maintain that sense of alliance and common interests among those Asia-Pacific democracies, I think would be very helpful. And that's on a kind of larger political or geopolitical front. Like I said earlier, there is a lot to do in terms of maintaining the vigilance in the education system, in the civics education, for example, as well as in the political discourse. An open discourse, I think, is really important to acknowledge the dangers and shadows of the past in specific countries, and to see how in a democracy you can prevent this phenomenon that's universal around the world, and that is a person who is dictatorial in orientation from gaining power.
I think this has been a very important and instructive discussion. Thank you very much for your time, Professor, and I hope we get to talk again soon.
All right, thank you.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more from TaiwanPlus News, you can follow us on social media or visit our website. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
We bring you stories from Taiwan.
Every day of the week.
Our reporters travel the nation.
Exploring the issues that matter to you.
News from here in Taiwan and around the world.
What's up, Taiwan? On TaiwanPlus.